I thought I'd start with the question that I'm going to focus on is, how can we think of social responsibility in relation to the subjects and subjectivities enacted by our very methods? I think from all the discussions that we've had today, we can certainly say that methods are doing a lot of things in the world, and they have different ethical and social consequences. But for me, one responsibility of the researcher is to account for the normative and political assumptions that are embedded in their methods regarding the subjectivities that they enact. Now, this is a perspective that comes out of a particular theme at CREST called the social life of methods that I co-lead with John Law, and who also we've also were joined by Mike Savage, who was previously at Manchester, but we also still engage a lot on this theme with Mike. And I'm going to give it a little bit of background work on what we mean by the social life of methods, or by the acronym SLOM, which is a little bit awkward, but it's easier and less of a mouthful. And then I'm going to follow this with an example, or some examples from my research on enumerating populations, which is perhaps pretty apropos since we are in a census year right now in the UK. And what we mean by SLOM is that methods are of the social in two ways. And the first way, I guess, is really coming out of what the last discussion was about, that there's a lot of things that go into what methods do, a lot of social things that methods are enrolled in, whether it's things such as theories and understandings of the social, particular purposes, different actors, different technologies, different advocates, different funders. There is a social world of methods and how they come into being. This is sort of a way of saying we have to think about this sort of ominous figure that is floating about in our discussions of this so-called sovereign researcher who's doing methods, as though those methods don't also have connections to disciplines, to institutions, to fundings, to careers, to long, I guess, history of the development of the method itself. So this is against the sovereignty of the researcher, and to say we have to think of the social life of a method and how it also not only comes to be legitimized, but also all the different things and people that get enrolled in its doing. But we also understand that methods help to constitute that very sort of social world we're talking about. We don't argue about methods as just merely representing, because this means we have to hold apart the world from the sort of representations and knowledge that we're creating. Instead, we take this performative view, which was talked about this morning a bit, and we start from the assumption that those methods are active in creating the very objects and subjects that we are out to ostensibly describe. We help to constitute them, and it's that relationship that we're interested in. So our assumption is methods have effects in the world that we choose to investigate. They simultaneously enact objects and subjects, and they represent what they also come to act on in the social world. So if we understand that, or take that as a starting point, we say, well, if we have different methods, then with different methods, we are then perhaps enacting different reals and shaping the social world, and that there are alternative worlds possible of those that we can both be involved in creating and representing. And the ethical and political questions are then, which are the best? Or how might we evaluate the relative merits of all of these alternatives? We've been talking roughly about quantitative and qualitative, and there's lots of different methods in both of those. That's a huge generalization. So can we then say, with these alternatives, how can we evaluate them and which are best? And one way, I would argue, is that we can evaluate the normative and political assumptions, again, that are embedded in them. And the part that I will focus on is about subjects and subjectivities, and that contains certain normativities and politics. So let's take enumerating populations, which I said was my example. Census year, and for the first time we could log into the internet, fill out our forms if you did so, but as many have noted, this may indeed be the last census, because lots of governments, not only here but elsewhere, are looking at alternative methods to enumerate populations, and they're mobilizing the power and capacities of new information technologies and digitization to do things such as joining up administrative databases, some of the ones that James just spoke about. That is, that records that are really about transactions between the citizen, the person, and different government agencies. And that these, whether it's your registrations, your licensing, your national insurance, or perhaps even your taxation, are deemed as more real-time, up-to-date registers of population. So it's what people are doing, as being a better register and indicator of the real population out there. So now there are a lot of technical debates about that, and what's often called transactional data, whether or not it's a better measure of that population that's out there. But we take the first understanding of methods that I mentioned earlier that I put forward as being constituted by the social to start to question how this method is bound up with a particular theory, conceptualization of population and of subjects. I've argued in a lot of the work that I've done on this that it's a conception, first of all, of population as being dynamic and mobile and moving, and that it needs to be traced and tracked. That these old methods, such as censuses, are snapshots, pictures of a fixed entity. We now want to understand it as a moving and mobile and changeable entity. And so we need techniques that can do that kind of tracking of that population. And that means we have to enroll particular kinds of actors and techniques and interpreters and gatekeepers and use those, such as joining up data, in order to know that population. So we enroll a whole other kind of social set of actors and techniques in doing that. So rather than thinking about this as just a mentalist act or conception, we have to look at all of these different enrollments and problematizations and advocates that get involved in that very method. So here we have the first version. What if we were to ask, what about this method in constituting and ordering the social? Or we could use that jargon I talked about earlier, that we're not just representing reality out there, that population isn't just already always given, but that we are also, through this method, engage in a performative act of the social, or of population in this case. So, well, first we know that it's not just any kind of social. Rather, in my example, we have certain kinds of populations being performed that are different from those being performed through a census. Certain realities perhaps are being brought into being, while others are being closed off as possibilities. And if, like the census, this is reproduced, we will be reproducing particular ways of thinking and knowing and conceiving of a population. But if we're like all good social scientists, as we've been probably trained, then we have to also look at those agendas and effects that aren't obvious. We can, as I've been pointing to already, talk about those kinds of assumptions and theories and conceptions that perhaps we know about, but we also have to look at how methods, when they are done and they are active, that they also produce what John Laws called collateral realities. Methods, as we prescribe them, don't always come out and turn out the way that we expect them once they're in the field. There are a whole other things and people that get enrolled in them, in a way that they also come to have these kind of distributive effects in the field, as it were, in some of the examples we had earlier, or even when one is doing in their nice office in university, looking at data and doing analysis. Lots of unexpected things happen. Changes in decisions occur, changes in criteria, etc. The method doesn't just get applied, in other words. So here I've been talking about, in the reference to enumeration, that we could think about how both an object and subject of population are being constituted. And the subject here, we would talk about a doing person who's transacting. That there's a subjectivity involved of the person as being a person interacting, engaging with government, with official departments. And that is the person, through those engagements, who's able to reveal themselves to us. If we think about the census, we can talk about the subject as a self-eliciting person who is asked to say who you are, albeit in relation to categories and questions that are framed by the census, but yet, as we know, for those of us who do research on censuses, see, people don't always answer the way they are expected, and people challenge categories and questions, and people have also historically mobilized and intervened in the very writing and making of the census. So we could say that the census opens up those kinds of possibilities of intervention, and a particular kind of subject is assumed, one who can speak for themselves, who can also elicit things about themselves and elect to identify according to particular ways that they feel are relevant to themselves. So we could say this kind of subject, is one that the social sciences, in terms of research methods, have drawn from largely the sciences and sort of revealing the interiority of the subject, and the subject being the one who can confess and tell who they are. Now, if we were to think about the transactional, which I just sort of use as a comparison to this, we could say that the speaking subject no longer really comes to bear as important, but it's the doing one. And it's an observational kind of method that is enrolled here that sees the subject in a very different way as a doing person as opposed to as speaking for oneself. And the question then we ask about comparing methods in this way, are these the kinds of subjects? and populations, if you will, that we are interested in or that we want to be active in creating. And what kinds of collectivities are they propagating? So, especially if we think about the kind of example that I'm using in the fact that these methods are enrolled in governments then intervening in individual lives, we also have governing consequences and need to attend to what kinds of possibilities and impossibilities are closed off by our different methods, because we also intervene directly in lives. So this then is basically the second part of my argument about the social life of methods. If they're social, then methods also help to create worlds by establishing conditions of possibility about ways of being and ways of intervening. And for this and other reasons, we talk about methods as having lives, being lively, having relations, circulating, reproducing, having genealogies of problems, purposes, actors, techniques, subjects, and subjectivities, and so on. And these are the kinds of questions that we need to raise. So we're not just talking about method. I think when we come to these kinds of discussions, we're talking more politics and normative questions about the social worlds and subjectivities that we're involved in and enrolled in creating and realizing. And it's to make those explicit and also to open up questions of those that we cannot know in advance, but we have to understand and see as they are made, as our methods do things in the world that we need to attend to. So that basically summarizes, in, I think, a brief way, this social life of methods thing, but also through a particular example, how one can think about it. And just to close, I would note that what I have described here is not a method, per se, that I have taken into the field. I have done statistical analyses, et cetera, but a method for thinking about methods. And I think this morning, I can't remember who raised that point, but I think we're talking about both of these, sometimes separately and sometimes in an interconnected way. But a lot of us, I think in the social sciences, are struggling with a method for thinking about method, and perhaps that's something that we can put on the agenda. Thank you.